Hi, I'm Tom Davis, and this presentation is on working to save women's and children's lives. I wanted to give you a bit of an overview of some of my journey in international public health. When I was in college, I actually studied pre-med, but then after learning about world hunger, I really wanted to engage uh, to do something in lower and middle income countries. So I decided to go to Haiti and serve in 2 years in a volunteer position. While I was there, I was coordinating vaccination and community health programs in the southern peninsula of Haiti. I learned Haitian Creole and some French, and I really found that child survival was my calling at that point, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that a bit later. After that, I realized that what I wanted to do, partly from my discussions with John Brody at UNICEF when I was there, was to do public health, and I got a master's in public health at UNC Chapel Hill in the US. I focus on health behavior and health education. And some of the connections I made with people are still important. Some of my best friends today are people that I went to public health school with. After that, I went to the Dominican Republic. I helped set up a national community health worker supervisor and community health worker training for a national NGO and a faith-based organization. I developed barrier analysis. I'll be telling you a bit about that tool, and I learned Spanish. After that, I started doing some consulting and also working part-time with an organization called Cure Americas that was in Bolivia and Guatemala. I was based out of the US, but I realized that child survival was possible, that reducing deaths of young children and dramatically reducing that was very possible. And part of that was seeing this work by Cure Americas that was reducing child deaths by about 50%. I also did consulting and then full-time work with Food for the Hungry. I eventually became their chief program officer over all sectors of their work, but did a lot in the HIV pandemic and I saw this increasing importance of social and behavior change while I was doing that work. I helped co-pioneered something called the care group approach, which I'll tell you about while I was working with Food for the Hungry. I did some work with Feed the Children briefly. That was we did both work in the international realm and also domestic hunger work in the U.S., which is a story in itself. And it was my first work in early child development, where I started looking into the Thrive agenda. How do we move beyond survival and helping children to thrive by improving early child development? I went back to consulting at one point. I developed a model called the Education Cascade Group model with Project Concern International. There was successful testing of that in Tanzania. Then I was hired by World Vision back in 2017 and was given leadership over their $7 billion US portfolio. A lot of that was in terms of setting the strategy, the vision, being able to help in terms of development of some new models like the Nurturing Care Group model, which I helped them to develop, and managing a team of professionals. And now I'm working with Gabby and focusing on a couple of questions. One, should we integrate nutrition with immunization? And if so, how? And I'll be doing that for the next few months. Now, one of the most important things I've done in my career, mostly in INGOs, was to develop and scale approaches, models, tools, and programmatic guidance. I've managed teams and done a lot of evaluations and other things, but it's that creative work and scaling that I think I've contributed to the most. This is a tool, barrier analysis, that I developed about 2 years after I got out of public health school. And really, right after you get out of public health school might be the time that you do some of your best innovation and creative work. I realized that I'd learned about these different behavior change models and behavioral determinants of behavior in public health school, but didn't really know what to do with all of that. In particular, we needed a tool that could help us know which determinants were at play for a given health or other behavior, what the barriers and enablers were for people. And barrier analysis is a rapid assessment formative research tool to identify the behavioral determinants associated with a particular behavior, such as getting a COVID-19 vaccine or exclusively breastfeeding a baby. And we do these studies in order to develop more effective behavior change messages and activities. It's based on the health belief model and the theory of reason to action models, but you actually can integrate in other models with it. And a key feature is that you interview those people doing a behavior, the doers, and compare their responses to those who are not, the non-doers. This ended up being a very useful tool to a lot of people. Barrier analysis has now been used in more than 40% of all lower and middle income countries by 39 different organizations and agencies, including UNICEF and many INGOs. And more published literature on these studies is coming out, in addition to a rich gray literature on it. It's rapid, it's easy, and it's actually something that students like you can use in the context of a master's program. The training manual is now in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, and we used it extensively during the pandemic as well. You can read more about it later if you're interested, but I wanted to share it with you so you can begin thinking about problems and tools. And the main tool I associate with Joe is lot quality assurance sampling, which he popularized amongst NGOs, and it is still scaling globally. That tool was based on the problem of needing to know what was going on in smaller geographic areas like district supervision areas without using a larger sample. And I used it in Mozambique on a large care group project, and I think it's one of the reasons we had such tremendous success, having that information that we could give to supervisors. I've added a link to the bottom of this slide if you want to hear a narrated presentation from this year's Agriculture, Nutrition, and Health Academy meeting in the UK, where I give an example of how we use this tool and others. I also mentioned implementation models and approaches. And the approach I'm most known for is the care group approach, which I co-pioneered back in 1997 with people from World Relief and then other INGOs. The care group approach is a community-based strategy for improving coverage and behavior change. And it was developed initially by Dr. Peter Ernst with World Relief in Mozambique. And we did the first large-scale implementation of the model in a population of more than 1 million people in Mozambique with Food for the Hungry that reduced malnutrition 38% and child deaths by about 30% at a cost per beneficiary per year of less than $3 US. And since that time, more than 30 other organizations have used this approach in more than 30 new countries, and I assisted a number of them when I was consulting. So finding a model of something that you're good at, something that you know, or maybe help develop is one way to use what you're learning. The approach focuses on building teams of volunteer women who are selected by their peers, who then represent, serve, and do behavior promotion with both male and female caregivers in blocks of about 12 households each. And by using home visits, the volunteers are more likely to reach both men and women caregivers and their children, actually, older children who often help care for younger children, and to change those gender norms. I created the nurturing care group model while at World Vision, combining this care group approach with the WHO's nurturing care framework in order to promote behaviors across that framework in health, nutrition, WASH, child protection, agriculture, and also mental health. And note that the volunteers used in this model are pure volunteers. They have a light workload. They receive no monetary incentives, just job aids. And despite that, we often see volunteer dropout rates of 5% or less a year. I believe in paying full-time community health workers and then having a second team of community health volunteers who work no more than 8 hours a week. And this model lets you do that. Now, there's a ton of evidence on this model now, but this is a key one. This is a 2015 study where we compared 10 care group and 9 non-care group projects in 5 African and Asian countries. They had approximately the same budget, the same project length, and were done about in the same time period. And what we found was that the projects using that care group approach had better results on all 15 indicators that we compared. The care group projects also had double the behavior change of non-care group projects and 53% greater estimated under 5 mortality reduction as a result. Although the mortality reduction was only significant at the P is less than 0.1 level, so not quite statistically significant. Now, there was a verse from a faith tradition that had a really profound effect on the trajectory of my career. And it comes from the book of Isaiah, or from the Nevi'im, if you're Jewish. And it says, "Never again will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not live out his years." This is a call to child survival and to global health. And it really helped me to see that I could have confidence that this would happen one day, slowly, progressively, and not necessarily without setbacks. I first heard about what we could do in child survival during a speech by John Brody with UNICEF at a meeting in Haiti around 1983. And he was talking about how we could save a child's life with oral rehydration serum for only about 5 cents. He did not focus on the huge problem that lay in front of us, the severity of the problem with diarrheal deaths. Instead, he focused on what we could do about it, the fact that we could lower deaths dramatically and cheaply. And at that time, about 14 million children were dying in the developing world every year. James Grant, who was the head of UNICEF, did not really shape things up there until he traveled with Dr. Rody to China and in Haiti, which is where I heard John speak. And when he got back to New York, he knew he had found his big idea, this idea for child survival. But his vision was that morality must march with capacity. We can do it, therefore we must. And under his leadership between 1990 and 2019, in less than 3 decades, child deaths decreased more than 60%. Jim worked with faith, political, and health leaders to make this happen. And on the other end of the spectrum, global life expectancy has more than doubled in the past 100 years or so. Sweden has kept meticulous records, and in 1840, life expectancy in Sweden was only 45 years. It's good to remember, we in more developed countries, we're often where people were now in lesser developed countries not that long ago. But today in Sweden it's 83 years, and in 2015 the average life expectancy globally was 71 years. There are researchers who believe that average lifespan may increase to over 100 years by mid-century. And there are more women surviving childbirth. The proportion of women who die during or around childbirth dropped by 45% over the 14 years, and the number of HIV infections per 100 adults declined by about 44% over a decade. So one of the reasons I'm saying this is it's good to remember things can change. Things really have changed in terms of global health, and we should set our sights high on what else we can do. There's also a promise from the Judeo-Christian tradition that people will build houses and dwell in them. They'll plant vineyards and eat their fruit. No longer will they build houses and others live in them, or plant and others eat. And that to me is a promise on the reversal of inequity and the progress on poverty, which is a livelihoods promise. It's all about ownership, having enough to eat, and being self-reliant. And this too is coming to pass. In the past 20 years, we've cut in half the absolute poverty rate, the proportion of people living on $1.25 a day or less, or $1.90 a day, depending on what cutoff you use. And it's true that even if you exclude the incredible improvements seen in China, that still is true. And note the graph on the right. This reduction in absolute poverty is despite huge increases in global population. Yes, the rate of reduction did slow between 2015 and 2017, and extreme poverty may be rising for the first time in 10 years, especially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, but only about 3 percentage points, from about 6% to 9%. And I think this will be a temporary setback, a blip. If you look at the graph on the right, note there were two other temporary increases, small upward bumps that I've circled, and then we continued progress after that. So there are reasons for hope. I've been reading Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness, and what is shocking is how these gains are not the exception, but the rule, and yet many of us do not perceive that to be the case. I think that may be particularly true among those of us who spend a lot of time sounding the alarm on and drawing attention to the negative trends. But there's a lot of things that are improving. Take, for instance, these 16 bad things that are decreasing. This includes things that we take for granted like slavery and smallpox, which have either been eliminated or almost eliminated, but there are also huge drops in things like child labor, disaster-related deaths, battle deaths, oil spills, and the proportion of people who are undernourished. And there are a lot of good things on the rise. Some of them are a bit more trivial things, like having more movies to watch, more music to listen to, more people with mobile phones. But this also includes things like adult literacy rate, women's right to vote, people with protected water sources, people living in democratic countries, and infant immunization. And how about the reduction in time it takes to produce life-saving vaccines that we've seen? Alongside some of the tragedies we've seen, there are a lot of bright spots, more light than darkness. And people like Joe, your professor, have helped to make some of this happen. And a lot of my colleagues have been involved in this sort of work. And you will be too. Now, climate is an outlier. And I really hope some of you will focus on climate, as it will drive many other public health problems, including increased and more frequent pandemics. And I've been doing more work there, such as writing USAID guidance on how to apply social behavior change to climate adaptation. And we still have a long way to go on improving gender equity as well. But here are two areas where we still need to make a lot of progress as well. One is to move past the stalled improvement in full vaccination of children. That solid blue line, and it's a solid blue line here on the graph, and it's one of the most life-saving interventions that we have. And note that it plateaued along with measles immunization in 1990 at about 75%, which is still not high enough. There was a 79% increase in measles cases in the first 2 months of this year, and conditions are ripe for really serious outbreaks of vaccine preventable diseases unless we learn how to take it up above that threshold. And there's still about 1.5 million deaths each year from vaccine preventable diseases. Another problem is of zero-dose children, children who have not received any vaccines. It's particularly problematic as they face multiple deprivations. They're more likely to be malnourished, to have poor wash, and to have a lot of other issues. And so that's why Gavi, where I'm working now, is really focused on reducing zero-dose children. And note in the graph on the right, this is on stunting, that there's been good progress in reducing child stunting. But there's still about 35% of under 5 children who are stunted, and most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where we've made less progress. So that's an area where we still need to see a lot more work being done. Here are a few recommendations for you based on my experience and my take on the future. One is look for field-based positions and get that field-based experience early on. I was recently turned down for a job because despite having 6 years overseas experience in Latin America and the Caribbean, I had not lived long-term in Africa or in Asia. I regret that. Latin America and the Caribbean and Southeast Asia have made the most progress, so I would consider working in fragile countries in particular, and in West Africa, where progress is lagging a bit. Also, seek out mentors. I learned the most by working alongside and staying in touch with some of the most brilliant people in international public health. People like Joe, Henry Perry at Johns Hopkins, and David Shanklin when I worked with them at Cure Americas. Also, when you see a problem that doesn't have a dominant model or tool, or has been underperforming, those underperforming models and tools where you can probably make improvements in those, consider working on them. And that will help address an issue. You can create guidance, and then you can get that guidance translated and disseminated, and think about then how to promote scaling of it. This really, I think, is some of the best work that you can do to move things forward and contribute to outcomes. It involves a certain amount of specialization. And don't assume that the current tools that are being used are the best. There's some very popular models out there that don't really work all that much, like community-led total sanitation, which in half of the randomized trials had null effect. Also, excuse me, learn to speak at least 2 languages other than English, and the most useful will be French or Arabic probably. Spanish is increasingly not useful given the direction of foreign aid, and the best place to learn a new language is where you'll be immersed in it, so in a field setting. Even living in Geneva, my French has only progressed to an intermediate level since English is the language used by most agencies here, like Gavi and World Vision. Also, identify and nurture the reasons for your hope. Be clear-eyed, but avoid cynicism. Remember, Martin Luther King Jr. said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Things can take a while, but you need to draw on your philosophy of life or your faith if you're a person of faith. You might be working on some of the worst problems that history has faced and new problems, so you need that courage and resilience for this work that comes from a deeper place. Many women and national staff are now moving up through the ranks, as they should. Things are diversifying and changing, so be bold in your ambitions. There's nothing that you can't do at this point, I think. Consider specialization in an area that is and probably will continue to be problematic in the future and exciting to you. I chose social behavior change, and it's still really exciting to me. So in closing, one thing I would suggest you do is to just ask life to use you until you're thoroughly used up, and then pass along what you learn as you do so. This photo is of Carl Taylor, who founded the discipline of international health and who was also a man of deep spiritual conviction that I really admire. Among other things, he was the primary World Health Organization consultant in preparing documents for the 1978 Alma Ata World Conference on Primary Health Care. Talk about a big job. And he dedicated his life to the well-being of the world's most marginalized people. And I think of him every time I read this quote by George Bernard Shaw. The organization he founded actually was called Future Generations. And here's the quote. "This is the true joy in life, the being used for a purpose recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. I am of the opinion that my life belongs to the whole community, and as long as I live, it is my privilege to do for it whatever I can. I want to be thoroughly used up when I die, for the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. Life is no brief candle to me. It is sort of a splendid torch which I've gotten to hold up for the moment, and I want to make it burn as brightly as possible before handing it on to future generations like you." Thank you very much.